Well, good afternoon. What a wonderful program these last 2 days, and it's good to be back. Secretary Baker, distinguished guests and speakers, I'm John Martin. I'm the managing partner of Baker Botts, and we are proud to sponsor the Baker Institute and to be a part of today's event. As most of you know, members of Secretary Baker's family were among the founders of our law firm nearly 2 centuries ago. And it is my pleasure to introduce Secretary Baker as our keynote speaker today. While you don't need me to tell you that Secretary Baker has enjoyed a long and distinguished career in public service, here are just a few of the many highlights. Secretary Baker is the man who led presidential campaigns for Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Bush over the course of 5 consecutive presidential campaigns. Secretary Baker is the man who served under Secretary of Commerce as Undersecretary of Commerce for President Ford, served as Chief of Staff for Presidents Reagan and Bush, served as President Reagan's Treasury Secretary, where, as you know, he spearheaded the historic and bipartisan 1986 Tax Reform Act. From 1989 to 1992, he served as the 61st Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush. During his tenure, he traveled to over 90 countries and confronted the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of a post-Cold War period. And Secretary Baker is the man who laid the foundation of the reunification of Germany and forged and assembled an unprecedented coalition that forced Iraq out of Kuwait. He organized the Madrid Peace Conference, which for the first time brought Israel and all neighboring Arab countries together. And if that's not enough, he's also the honorary chair of this institute, which is named after him. Secretary Baker is also the great-grandson of one of the founders of the firm, and I'm proud to call him my partner. We are delighted to have him and all of you with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Baker.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, John, for a very generous introduction, but particularly thank you for your very able leadership of Baker Botts as its managing partner. Ladies and gentlemen, I am particularly proud that this event is the product of cooperation between the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies and Baker Botts, because both of those organizations are very close to my heart. And their record of partnership over the years now, I think, is an impressive testament to the power of collaboration. I want to discuss with you today some of the challenges that face our nation, at least as this old former diplomat sees them, starting with a few comments about Afghanistan. Last month, we withdrew our troops from that nation, concluding our 20-year military involvement there. Like many of you, and I know like many other Americans, I was dismayed by the sheer chaos of our departure. Images of fleeing Afghans falling from U.S. transport planes and thousands of others clamoring for evacuation will become, sad to say, part of our collective American memory. But I was also proud of the courage and the compassion of American servicemen and women during the tough times, those full 20 years. Not least, I felt, and I still feel now, a profound sympathy for the Afghan people, especially the women and girls who must now live under that fanatical Taliban rule. The story of our ill-fated involvement in Afghanistan is a long one, and there's plenty of blame to go around, bipartisan blame. I don't want to relitigate the policies undertaken by the 4 American administrations there. I'll leave that argument to the historians. However, I believe that President Biden made the absolutely correct decision to leave Afghanistan, as difficult as a decision as it was to make. What started as a mission to capture Osama bin Laden and stem the flow of terror from that country was transformed when bin Laden and most of his al-Qaeda minions escaped to Pakistan. In its place was a new U.S. mission, a difficult one intended to provide stability in a country where similar efforts led to humiliating defeats by both the British and Soviet empires. And now, 20 years later, I'd like to offer a few suggestions about how the United States can avoid similar costly ventures in the future. First of all, I would say we must have a clear objective and we must stick to it. The initial goal in Afghanistan was a necessary one, the destruction of al-Qaeda's safe haven. But over the years, our involvement there shifted to an exercise in nation building, a pluperfect example of mission creep. Now we have engaged in nation building in the past, of course, in various degrees. In Japan and Germany after World War II are good cases in point. But in neither of those instances did we have to confront a substantial domestic insurgency like we did in Afghanistan and like we also did, by the way, in Iraq as well after 2003. There's a second lesson, I think. We must define victory. We must devise a clear strategy to achieve that definition, and then have an exit strategy once we have won. Otherwise, we risk drifting into an endless conflict driven by inertia among our policymakers. Military and civilian bureaucracies will simply continue doing what they have in the past. A short way of saying that is, if you don't know how you're getting out, don't get in. That brings me to a third lesson. We must know our limits. While the United States may be the most powerful country in the world, our power is not boundless. We simply cannot transform countries like Afghanistan in our own image, and we should stop believing that we can. As the Bible reminds us, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. I think that's good advice for American foreign policy makers. We should remember it. Fourth and finally, we should be wary of setting public deadlines in military operations. Those deadlines encourage our adversaries to bide their time, gather their strength, and strike when we withdraw. That's precisely what unfolded in Afghanistan. Perhaps the best advice I can give our current policymakers is to cite the example that President George H.W. Bush set during Desert Storm, the successful U.S. military mission that ejected Iraqi troops from Kuwait in 1991. President Bush first told the world what he intended to do, and then he got international and domestic support for the mission. And finally, he did exactly what he said he would, and no more. He then brought our sons and daughters home. And after all of that, he got other countries to pay for almost all of the cost of that war, the only war America has ever fought in which we got others to pay the cost. Now, I'm very biased, of course, but I think this conflict represents a textbook example of the way to conduct a war, diplomatically, politically, and militarily. Leaving Afghanistan, of course, was never going to be pretty, because losing a war never is. But the manner of our departure, hurried, ill-prepared, and marked by dangerous wishful thinking, I think reflected badly on the Biden administration and reflected badly, my friends, on America as well. Admittedly, the speed of the final Taliban advance was shocking, but we should have known that it would be swift. And the Biden administration's lack of urgency surely contributed to the fiasco. The July evacuation of Bagram Air Base, our largest in Afghanistan, was an early sign of the mistakes that would follow. We slipped away in the middle of the night without even informing the new Afghan commander or our allies. The U.S. airlift of Americans and some of our Afghan allies was a remarkable logistical feat, but it came weeks too late. And with respect to those Afghans who had helped us, it was far too limited. Our commitment to these Afghan partners, especially the translators, is more than a matter of honor. It sends a clear signal around the world that the United States will remember its friends. Now, in concert with other countries, we must move quickly to address a massive refugee flow from Afghanistan. When the Vietnam War ended in 1975, President Ford acknowledged the serious human rights issues facing many South Vietnamese residents, and he began what became the relocation of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees to the United States. Now, I'm not sure there's political support today for such a massive program, a program similar to that. But we must accept our fair share of refugees, and we must provide humanitarian support for those who are stranded elsewhere. We must also accept the possibility that Afghanistan will become a base for terrorism against the United States or our allies. This, after all, is the reason we intervened in Afghanistan in the first place. Most importantly, the Biden administration must move quickly to mend the damage to U.S. credibility caused by the way we withdrew. Our partners around the world are clearly rattled by the shocking way in which our involvement ended. They doubt both U.S. commitment and U.S. competence. Our chaotic withdrawal will embolden our adversaries. This could be the case with the Chinese threat to Taiwan. We must spend the upcoming weeks and months assuring our partners about our reliability. And we should back up those assurances with measures, including, for instance, enhanced deployments in places like the South China Sea to signal that we mean business. Some have suggested that our defeat in Afghanistan marks the end of America's preeminent role in world events. I think nothing could be more wrong-headed, because in my 91 and a half years, I've learned that betting against Uncle Sam is a fool's wager. We remain in economic, diplomatic, political, and military terms by far the greatest nation on earth. And that power is multiplied and leveraged by our long-term alliances in Europe and East Asia. As China continues to emerge on the world stage, it will be critical for the United States to remain fully engaged in global affairs. Now, our way forward in Afghanistan is only one of many other serious challenges facing the United States. The biggest of these is our ticking fiscal debt bomb that threatens the financial strength of our country, and I would suggest other strengths as well. Debt skulls like I am seem to be a vanishing breed these days. But I really hope that isn't true, because America's position as the world's preeminent power rests on three foundations. First, our military power. Second, our network of alliances with other nations. And third, our economic strength. And absent a strong economic position, we cannot maintain our military power and our political alliances. Alarmingly, we have been spending money for the past 2 decades like drunken sailors. And that's true, ladies and gentlemen, about both Democratic and Republican administrations. Everybody seems to want a free ride, paid for by their grandchildren. The numbers today are staggering. In March of this year, our total national debt stood at $28 trillion. $28 trillion. That represents 108% of our gross national product, and it's almost double what it was just 2 decades ago when the debt to GDP ratio was 55%. And if those who are now in control of the White House and the House of Representatives get their way, there's a hell of a lot more to come. Left uncorrected, our national debt will be twice the size of our whole economy in 30 years, according to a recent Congressional Budget Office report. Of course, some economists will argue that the size of our national debt doesn't matter because interest rates needed to borrow that money are near historic lows, and they see no indication that they will dramatically rise anytime soon, if ever. But I want to tell you something. As a former Secretary of the Treasury, I don't believe that's a good bet. Inflation is starting to rise, although it's not clear yet if this is merely a short-term jump caused by kickstarting our economy after more than 15 months of the pandemic. Inevitably, however, ladies and gentlemen, the chickens are going to come home to roost. They always do. And interest rates will spike. And when that happens, not if it happens, but when it happens, repaying the debt will require more and more of our tax dollars that would be better spent on things that keep our nation strong. And I'm afraid that because of our lack of political will to do what we need to do in our fiscal policy, the only way we will correct the problem is by inflating our way out of it. And that, quite simply, is a terrible option, particularly for the poorest Americans who are the most hurt by inflation. Another serious challenge facing our nation and others, of course, is global climate change. I'm not sure, ladies and gentlemen, that it is the existential crisis that some claim it to be. Nevertheless, it is a very serious problem, one that we need to confront and one that we need to deal with. Because if the Al Gores of the world are correct, it's going to be a very serious and destructive thing. It's going to continue to get worse unless there is a global commitment to the reduction of carbon emissions. 4 years ago, the late Secretary of State George Shultz and I came forward with a proposal to resolve the political conundrum between Democrats and Republicans in the domestic battle we are now waging over climate change. Our plan called for a fee on all carbon emissions in the United States. That's an approach that most economists and the vast majority of Democrats believe is the most efficient and effective way to reduce such emissions. But rather than giving that money to the federal government, all of the revenues from the fee would be returned to Americans in the form of a quarterly dividend that would provide the vast majority of households with more money than they would pay in higher energy costs. As a result, therefore, this fee would not grow the federal government and should not be considered a tax. That may be something that's going to be difficult to sell to Republicans, but if they think about it, if it doesn't grow the government and it's rebated proportionally to all Americans, it ought not to be considered a tax. Of course, the only way this proposal would work politically is to return all of the revenues to Americans via quarterly dividends. Because if you don't do that, you're not going to get Republicans to the table, or you're not going to get them to agree. And you got to have both sides to solve this problem. I tell people all the time, this is more of a political problem today than it is anything else. If Washington were to divert all or some of the revenues from the carbon tax to other purposes, then it's not going to work politically, and the country will lose the opportunity for a long-term solution to carbon emissions. Excuse me. Now, getting one critical component of our carbon dividend plan is a cross-border adjustment, or tariff, that would rebate to U.S. manufacturers any fees they might have paid on exports to any nation that doesn't have a similar carbon program. And importantly, it would apply the fee to imports from non-complying nations. If any country refused to go along, it would have to pay such a tariff in order to send its goods into the United States, the world's largest market. This would obviously put pressure on China and others to reduce their own emissions or pay a surcharge to sell their goods in the United States. Now, we all know getting something through Congress will be very difficult. We're seeing that today, every day. We pick up the paper or turn on our TV because of the political dysfunction that is infecting Washington. But this brings me, ladies and gentlemen, to the final challenge that I want to discuss. During my 91 plus years, I have seen few issues as vexing and politically damaging as the one now posed by the incivility that poisons our entire society. The crassness of our political debate and the political dysfunction that accompanies it too often brings our governance to a standstill. Yes, I know politics ain't beanbag, and I know that firsthand, and I have the bruises to show for it. But as our national anger has grown, so too has our distrust of politicians, of our institutions, and of one another. Now, I'm not sure how you resolve this problem, because you can't legislate civility. But I do know that we need to start getting along better if we're going to remain the country we have been for most of our history. In Washington, that will take leadership from both parties. Republicans and Democrats must relearn how to compromise if they want to get things done. Doing that will require a commitment to cooling incendiary rhetoric. Meanwhile, all Americans, I think, have to shoulder some responsibility. We cannot allow our popular culture to become angrier and uglier and more vulgar, which is happening. Each of us should recognize that in a democracy, no one side gets to make all the rules. Our country has survived and it has thrived, in large part because we've worked together in the past on important issues. In a democracy, absent the art of compromise, chaos can ensue. And above all, my friends, I think we need to start listening to one another rather than just yelling at one another. When someone makes a point, listen to it, regardless of how incorrect it may seem to you. Don't discount people just because you don't agree with them. Listening is an important part of learning about one another and from one another that sends a clear signal of respect. And in this country, we need to do more listening and less shouting, because I really fear, ladies and gentlemen, that the things that bind us together as Americans are getting lost in the noise. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't really have much to add to that, obviously. It's a tough act to follow, but I will say this entire summit has been remarkable. I think we've actually brought a lot of really important issues to the table. We were able to highlight some areas where there's some real challenges, but with every challenge, there's also an opportunity. So it's a matter of figuring out how to navigate those challenges so you turn them into opportunities. And I think there's an abundance of those in front of us. I look forward to hearing, what transpires at Glasgow. I think there's a lot of potential for some real movement. I reserve judgment on what's going to happen, but I remain optimistic nonetheless. So with that, I am going to close the summit. Thank you all for being in attendance, and here's to next year being completely in person instead of just partially in person.